Of course, the name on the lawyer's email, Eleanor Vance, was my grandmother's. My quiet, gentle grandmother who always seemed to be running a silent, defensive campaign on my behalf. The eviction notice my father had just handed me was not a new threat. It was just the final, logical conclusion to the terms of my existence in this family. I was the scapegoat, and this property was their leverage. I remember the great storm of last year. A massive oak branch, ancient and heavy, cracked and fell, shattering a window in my guest house. It was a terrifying act of nature. I called my father, shaken. His response wasn't concern. It was an accusation. "If you had been more diligent about raking the leaves in your yard, you would have noticed that branch was weak," he'd said, his voice cold. "The repair is coming out of your pocket. This is what happens when you're not responsible." I was blamed for a thunderstorm. They used their power as landlords to police my life. When I started dating a musician, a kind, wonderful man they deemed unsuitable, my mother staged an intervention. "We don't want his kind on this property," she'd said. "We have an image to maintain. If you can't make better life choices, Catherine, you can't expect to have the privilege of living here." My personal life was a lease violation. My happiness was a breach of contract. What they never understood or chose to forget was that they were never the true owners. My grandfather, a wise and quiet man, saw his son's tyrannical nature. When he died, he left the entire property in a trust managed by my grandmother with a single secret clause. He knew my father would try to control me, and he knew my grandmother would try to protect me. In her quiet way, she always did. She'd forget to cash the checks I wrote for repairs. She'd admire the very friends my mother criticized. She knew the truth of their hearts, and her will, I now realized, was her final perfect act of protection. My parents, in their arrogance, saw my grandmother's death as the moment they finally gained full control. They didn't realize it was the moment they lost everything. They thought they were finally strong enough to exile the scapegoat. They had no idea my grandmother had just handed her the keys to the entire kingdom. I stood there for a long time after they left, the silence of the guest house buzzing in my ears. In one hand, I held the cruel, imagined power of their eviction notice. In the other, I held the real, legal power of my grandmother's final act on my phone. It felt like a scene from a dream, a moment of impossible cosmic irony. My hand shook as I called the lawyer's office the next morning. When I sat down in front of him, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Albright, he looked at me with a knowing sadness. "I was expecting your call, Catherine," he said. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, very meticulous. She and your grandfather set this all up years ago." He opened a thick folder and turned it around for me to see. It was the deed to the property, the trust documents, and finally, the will. He pointed to the key passage. "The trust your grandfather created gave your grandmother, Eleanor, full control as trustee," he explained. "Your parents were granted residency, not ownership. Upon Eleanor's passing, the trust was designed to dissolve, and all assets were to be transferred directly to you. This property, Catherine, the main house, the guest house, all of it, is legally and indisputably yours." I stared at the black ink on the page, my own name, Catherine Vance, listed as the sole proprietor. "The eviction notice your father gave you," Mr. Albright continued, a small, wry smile on his lips, "is a fascinating but legally meaningless piece of paper. They have no authority to evict you. In fact, given that you are now the legal owner of the property they reside on, you are, for all intents and purposes, their landlord." Those words, their landlord. The phrase hit me with the force of a physical blow. The entire power dynamic of my life, the constant looming threat of being cast out, the precariousness of my existence under their roof, had not just been neutralized. It had been completely and perfectly inverted. For my entire life, I had lived in fear of their power. I now realized I was the one holding all of it. They weren't tyrants in their castle anymore. They were tenants in my house. And rent, I decided, was about to be due. For a few days, I let them savor their victory. I kept to my guest house and they kept to the main house, two separate planets orbiting a sun of mutual resentment. They were smug, confident, waiting for the moving boxes to appear on my porch. They thought they had finally won. So I decided to give them one last test, to hand them one final golden opportunity to be decent human beings. I knew the roof on the main house had a bad leak, a problem they'd been complaining about but ignoring. For years, I walked over, knocked on the door, and put on my most concerned, dutiful daughter face. "Hi," I said when my mother answered. "I know my 30 days aren't up yet, but I wanted to mention the leak in your attic. The forecast says heavy rain is coming this weekend, and I'm worried it could cause some real damage if you don't get it looked at." My father came to the door, a smirk on his face. "Catherine, I think you have bigger things to worry about than our roof, like where you'll be living next month." "I'm just trying to be helpful," I said softly. He crossed his arms, a cruel, calculating look in his eyes. "You want to be helpful? You know, that leak started right after you had that satellite dish installed years ago. Your technician probably cracked the shingles. This is your damage. This is your responsibility." My mother nodded eagerly, the final nail in the coffin. "He's right, dear. It's only fair that you pay for the repairs. You can't just cause a problem and walk away from it." And there it was, the purest, most undiluted expression of who they were. They were willing to let their own home rot just to pin the blame on me one last time. They were so addicted to having a scapegoat that they would rather invent a fantasy where I was responsible than face the simple, boring reality of a routine home repair. They didn't just fail the test. They had set it on fire. I looked at them, at their smug, triumphant faces, and I felt a profound sense of peace. The last bit of doubt, the last flicker of familial obligation, was gone. They had just given me the most beautiful, liberating gift of all, a complete and total freedom from guilt. "You know what?" I said, a small, genuine smile spreading across my face. "You're absolutely right. It's my responsibility. I'll take care of the roof." They nodded, satisfied, thinking they'd just won their final victory. They had no idea I was agreeing not as their scapegoat, but as their landlord. In my family, I was the designated scapegoat. Every problem, from a leaky faucet to my father's bad mood, was somehow my fault. And my parents held the ultimate power over me. They were also my landlords. I lived in the small guest house on their property, a place that was less of a home and more of a cage where the bars were made of obligation and the threat of eviction was always in the air. Tonight, they finally pulled the trigger. My crime, my car, an old clunker, had leaked, a small patch of oil on their pristine driveway. My father stood before me, his face a mask of cold fury, my mother beside him looking disappointed. "This is the last straw, Catherine," he said, the words like stones. "Your constant irresponsibility is a blight on this property. We want you out. You have 30 days to pack your things and leave." They were exiling me, over a patch of oil. As I stood there, the world shrinking to a pinprick of panic and shame, my phone buzzed. It was an email from a law firm with the subject line, "Regarding the estate of Eleanor Vance." My grandmother. She had passed 3 weeks ago. My hands shaking, I opened it. My parents thought this property was theirs, a gift from my grandfather. They had forgotten that he'd actually left it in a trust, managed by my grandmother. And her final will and testament, attached to this email, was crystal clear. The entire property, the main house and the guest house, was now mine. They had just served me an eviction notice from a home they no longer controlled. The next morning, I didn't call a simple roofer. I called the best general contractor in the county. "My name is Catherine Vance," I said into the phone, the words feeling new and solid. "I'm the owner of 123 Willow Creek Lane. I need a full structural and systems inspection of the main house, effective immediately." At 10 o'clock sharp, a large, clean truck from Ridgeline Contracting pulled into the driveway. My father stormed out of the main house, his face thunderous. "I thought I told you to just get a quote. Who are all these people?" I was standing there to meet the crew, holding a clipboard. "You said the roof was my responsibility," I said, my voice crisp and businesslike. "I've decided to be responsible. I need to know the full extent of the damage before I proceed." The crew chief, a man named Henderson, walked up to my father. "Morning, sir. Ms. Vance, the property owner, has authorized a full home inspection. We'll need access to the attic, basement, and all crawl spaces. My father's face went blank. Owner? What are you talking about? She's a tenant. We are the owners. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. That seems to be a common misconception, I said, my voice carrying in the quiet morning air. But a very serious one. According to the final will and testament of my grandmother, Eleanor Vance, I am the sole legal owner of this entire property. The eviction notice you gave me a few days ago was, legally speaking, a work of fiction. My mother, who had come out to see what the commotion was, let out a small, strangled gasp. They stared at me, their faces a collage of shock, disbelief, and dawning, abject horror. I didn't give them time to recover. I turned to Mr. Henderson. The attic access is in the main hall closet, I said, my voice clear and authoritative. My parents will show you where it is. Let's start there. The crew started moving toward the house. My parents stood frozen in the driveway, two statues in the ruins of a kingdom they had never actually owned. The power hadn't just shifted. The truth had just come home, and it was about to start a full-scale renovation. The inspectors finished their work in the late afternoon. I stood in the living room with the full, damning report on a clipboard in my hand. My parents sat silently on the sofa, two monarchs in a kingdom that had just been dissolved. The house was quiet except for the sound of the contractors packing up their equipment outside. The report is extensive, I said, my voice as calm and neutral as a news anchor's. The roof is worse than I thought. There's dry rot in the attic beams. The wiring in the West Wing isn't up to code. This property has been fundamentally neglected for a very long time. My father started to speak, a weak protest, but I held up a hand. A few days ago, I said, pulling their crumpled, handwritten eviction notice from my pocket and placing it on the coffee table. You gave me this. You told me my irresponsibility was a blight on this property. You gave me 30 days to leave. I then placed a crisp, professionally printed document next to it. This is also an eviction notice. It is for you. It gives you 60 days to vacate the main house. My mother let out a sob. My father's face was a mask of pale, sputtering rage. You're throwing your own parents out on the street? No, I said, my voice still quiet. I'm not. You see, unlike you, I do feel a sense of responsibility. So your eviction comes with a relocation plan. I paused, letting them hang on the words. The guest house has been fully inspected and is perfectly safe. As of today, that is your new residence. You may live there, rent-free, for the rest of your lives. I looked at them, their entire world shrinking in a single moment. I will be moving into the main house to oversee the extensive and expensive repairs. I will be your landlord. The rules are simple. You will respect my property. You will respect my privacy. And you will never again treat me as your scapegoat. If you can't agree to these terms, then you are free to leave the property entirely. I stood up, leaving the documents on the table. Welcome to the neighborhood, I said, the words a final, perfect inversion of power. I trust you'll be quiet. Tenants. I turned and walked out, leaving them in the echoing halls of the house I now owned, demoted from tyrants to tenants, forever exiled to the very cage they had built for me. It's been a year. The main house, my house, is finally healed. The roof is new, the wiring is safe, and the rooms are filled not with tension and judgment, but with sunlight and the smell of my own baking. My grandfather's home is a sanctuary. Again. Last weekend, I hosted a party for my friends, the unsuitable ones my parents had always criticized. We played loud music and danced in the living room, and for the first time, I felt like the true and rightful owner of my own life. My parents are still in the guest house. They are quiet tenants. I see them sometimes, watching me from their window as I work in the garden my grandmother planted. We don't speak. There are no more lectures, no more accusations. There is only the vast, silent space of the lawn between us, a physical representation of the boundary they forced me to build. They have a roof over their heads, but they are homeless in a way I no longer am. They are now the ones on probation, living in the shadow of a life they once controlled, forced to be silent witnesses to the peace of the scapegoat they could not break. For so long, I believed that a home was a place you could be kicked out of. I learned that a true home is the place you can't be evicted from your own soul. It's the space where you have the right to be yourself, without justification or apology. To every person who has been made to feel like a tenant in your own life, you have the right to claim your territory. You have the right to change the locks. Share a story in the comments about the moment you became the sovereign of your own domain. Let's celebrate our sanctuaries. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe for more stories about flipping the eviction notice.